This is the story of how a bad trip affected me for a long time and how I got better. I am writing this almost 4 years after the trip in question. At the time of the trip, I was 26 years old and mentally and physically healthy, and always had been. I'm going to write about the trip, but also the long aftermath and how I recovered in the hopes that it can help someone. The trip. The bad trip I had was my 4th trip overall in my life, and my 3rd with LSD. I took 100 micrograms of 1p LSD purchased online. It was legal in my country at the time. I had taken higher doses before, up to 150 micrograms. The setting was at home in my apartment with my boyfriend of many years. We both took the same dose at about 2 p.m. and laid down in bed to trip. We had a vague intention of wanting the trip to bring us closer together in our relationship. For the first 2 hours or so, everything was good. I had interesting visuals and funny little thoughts that I don't need to detail here. About 2 hours in, I went to use the bathroom. I remembered that some people advised against looking in the mirror while on acid. I got the bright idea to try it and see what it was like. When I saw my reflection, there was just something off about it. I can't really explain it, but it shocked me horribly. I was grinning and looked somehow evil. I looked away, but the image of my face remained in my mind for a few seconds. I went back to bed and tried to shake off the horrible feeling that had suddenly arisen. Short tangent. Some of my friends who are into psychedelics really want to read into the fact that my own face was what started the bad trip. They see some kind of self-esteem issue or something. I always push back on this interpretation. I think I just don't like seeing distorted faces, period, mine or other people's. After I lay back down, I was still unsettled. A new tone of feeling had entered the trip, and I didn't like it. I wanted it to go away and started to hope that I wasn't going to have a bad trip. In retrospect, big mistake. The feeling got worse and worse over the next half hour or so until it dominated the entire trip. I kept trying to make it go away, but everything I tried made it worse. It was also getting dark, and that absence of light just made everything worse too. Everything was just bad and looked wrong, and I couldn't explain why. It was just pure suffering without a reason. I didn't tell my boyfriend until I knew I was 100% having a bad trip because I was afraid it would rub off on him. Once I said something, he supported me and got me some fresh air, which helped. I still felt like my whole reality was coming apart and I had no grip on anything at all. Anytime I thought I could grasp something comprehensible, it would melt away. Nothing was solid and it felt horrible. Definitely in the top 3 most horrible things I have ever experienced. That said, I still retained some awareness that this would stop, that I was having a bad trip and would just have to ride it out. Eventually, I started to meditate with my breath and discovered I could sit with these negative feelings and sort of tread water in them. I think if I had not been a meditator, it would have been worse. After a while, I could accept both the negative and the earlier positive aspects of the trip. I meditated until the effects started to wear off. Immediately after, I felt so strong for having gotten myself through that experience. I felt like a warrior, like I had learned what it had meant to suffer and come out on the other side whole. I drew some art and journaled about it, then eventually went to sleep. Short-term effects, first 2 months after the trip. In the days and first few weeks after, I continued to feel really strong. It seemed obvious that a bad trip would happen to me eventually, and it felt like a rite of passage in my psychedelic journey. I continued to draw and journal and spoke to a few friends, 2 of whom had similar experiences before. I felt like I had realized my own strength, and everyday annoyances could not faze me anymore. A few times I noticed some small after effects. About 3 days after the trip, I was in a crowded train with my boyfriend. It suddenly started to feel very cramped, and I felt trapped and nauseous. I really wanted to get off the train. I was aware that this was not a normal level of anxiety for riding a train. With my boyfriend's help, I wrote it out and felt better as soon as we got out at our stop. I figured that this was an after effect of the difficult trip and told my boyfriend that I was afraid to be someone who had mental health issues now. He assured me that it would probably not last. Apart from that, I noticed a small difference in my meditation practice. Sometimes when I would end a meditation session, something about the world just seemed off. I can't really explain what. I saw a potential connection to the bad trip, but was not too worried. Weird things happen in meditation all the time. And once, a few days before things got really bad, I was sitting in a bookstore waiting for someone for a half an hour or so. I started to wonder what it would be like to have a flashback right now, by myself, with no one but strangers to help. I felt anxiety rising and calmed myself down by telling myself that this simply would not happen, but this wasn't very effective. I felt anxious until my companion returned and we could go. Extreme difficulties, 2 to 6 months after the trip. On New Year's Eve going into 2020, I had the first of what I called anxiety attacks. These continued off and on for about 6 months. In retrospect, as someone who now works more closely with the DSM-5, I realized that at least some of them would have fit the criteria for panic attacks, just without the typical symptoms. I was with my family over the holidays and we went out to a restaurant. It was noon and I hadn't eaten yet, in anticipation of a big lunch. I was starting to feel a little sick because I hadn't eaten. Side note, this was common for me and later turned out to be a metabolic problem caused by my birth control. I ordered a sweet tea, which I didn't realize was caffeinated, and drank it fast, hoping to get my blood sugar up. Our food came and I ate slowly, but did not feel better. Eventually, I thought I was going to be sick, so I went to the bathroom. In the bathroom, all of a sudden, nothing looked right anymore. Or rather, everything looked normal, but nothing felt right. I felt a strong urge to get the hell out of there. I felt trapped. I went back to the table and moved my chair facing outward so I would feel less trapped. I saw some eye floaters and static on the wall in front of me. This was also actually not unusual. I've had light visual snow since childhood when looking at solid colors, especially when I'm dehydrated. I couldn't follow the conversation and everything seemed off. I told my mom I wasn't feeling well and we went outside. My heart sank when we went outside because outside was no better. The street didn't seem real. Nothing did. I felt like I was in another universe that was not my own, although everything looked absolutely normal. To make things worse, we had all planned to go to an escape room. I couldn't do it. I felt sick, dizzy, anxious, and wanted to flee. I was convinced this was some kind of flashback. The feeling of being trapped reminded me of the bad trip. These feelings escalated until I just laid down on the floor and stared at nothing. Eventually, my mom took me home. She figured I had the flu or had eaten something bad, and I didn't contradict her. I knocked myself out with some Dramamine and felt better after a nap. I'll interrupt this story with a note on how I feel about this first episode now, years later. I think it was caused in part by the trip, but also by the way I was thinking about the trip afterwards. I had never had any mental health problems or anxiety to speak of before, so despite the long latency period of 2 months, it feels dishonest to say this could have been unrelated to the trip. I would also describe the trip as a traumatic experience, and I don't use the word trauma lightly. I think some of my symptoms are best described as trauma reaction rather than a delayed drug effect. But beyond that, I'd spent the past 2 months ruminating about the possibility of having some kind of flashback to the bad trip. This is not at all unusual for me. I have always had a very active imagination and daydream every day. But this meant that the possibility of having a flashback was very present in my mind. I may have been more likely to panic at normal things, like floaters or dizziness from not eating, and interpret them as signs I'm having a psychedelic flashback or going crazy. I wonder sometimes if I worried so much about going crazy that I made myself crazy, or at least made it worse. Back to the story. The next day, the same thing happened again around lunchtime. Before it happened, I had been worried it would. I didn't tell my family about the derealization or the psychedelics, just that I was feeling sick, which was true. I knocked myself out with Dramamine again. Over the next few days, things got worse. I was waking up every morning with a sick, anxious feeling in my body. I think that was actually the worst part. I could not get away from this feeling. I woke up with it, and it would last most of the day. Within a week, I felt like I understood why someone might kill themselves. I'm not going to do it, but if this goes on for a year, I get it. I remember having that exact thought. The speed at which I went from a normal happy person to toying with the idea of suicide scared me then, and it scares me now. I was not in my right mind. Sometimes the anxiety would escalate briefly into a feeling of intense panic. This usually would happen when I wanted to leave the house. Once I went on a walk with my mother, and the feeling of the world not being real became extremely strong. Like in the bad trip, I had the strong feeling that something was very wrong and that I needed it all to stop, but I couldn't say why. I felt trapped in my own mind. This escalated until I confessed to my mother that I thought something was really wrong with me and broke down crying in the middle of the sidewalk. My mom, to her credit, stayed calm and walked me home. Her calmness plus the crying helped me feel better. Soon I went to my old GP in my hometown and she wrote me a script for clonazepam to take as needed until I could fly home after my holiday and get longer-term help. I made strict rules for myself to make sure I could not become too dependent on it. I did not want to leave the house, but I made myself do it. I knew that giving in would make it worse. I sometimes had my friend, a psychiatric nurse, go with me. She was very helpful because she reassured me that she had seen things like this before, and it usually stops. Being at my mom's house wasn't exactly comfortable either. It was the house I grew up in, but it also was not. Everything looked normal, and I never really had any visual psychedelic effects or psychedelic flashbacks, but I felt like I had woken up in an alternate, horrible universe, and I did not know how to get back home. I did not feel at home in the world anymore. For about 2 weeks, I woke up with this awful anxiety and derealization every day. Then I flew home with the help of clonazepam. Once I was home, the symptoms stopped being a daily thing and began to come and go. It became more common for me to go most of the day without anxiety, but then have an anxiety attack out of nowhere a couple times a week. Certain situations seem more likely to trigger them, e.g. being in an enclosed space like a car, being somewhere new, but they also happened at home. Sometimes there would be some lower grade anxiety preceding the attack, sometimes not. The episodes usually involved anxiety or panic, derealization, feeling sick, nauseous and shaky, occasionally shortness of breath, feeling like I'm about to lose control, and being afraid of other people seeing me like this. I would have to lie down and be barely able to move or speak. If someone asked me what was wrong, I could not tell them. It was like I would dissociate from the symptoms and be unable to verbalize that something was wrong at all. If in public, I would also be afraid of making a fool of myself or of no one helping me. I made myself go out when I could, but it was hard. Episodes usually ended in crying because that would always make them stop. The pandemic happened midway through this, and all of a sudden there was no expectation to go out in public anymore. This was actually good for me because it meant I could recover at my own pace. I was determined to get better. I would not accept that this was my life. I threw everything I could at the goal of getting better, changed my diet, exercised more, read tons of books, watched psychologists lecture on YouTube, practiced meditation and breathing exercises, and tried out mental tricks to try and help manage my symptoms. I would have signed up for therapy, but the pandemic made that unfeasible. Soon, the symptoms started to change. I started having flashback memories during anxiety attacks. The first couple of times, the memories were of the bad trip, but then they started to be memories from my teenage years. Nothing traumatic, just highly emotional. You might call them representative memories that were part of a pattern at the time. I remember feeling exactly like I was 15 again and rage crying in my own room, hating my parents. I was reliving it. Often there was a sense of catharsis after these flashbacks, which gave me the feeling that I was in a painful process that might hopefully have an end one day. That gave me some hope. A few things were particularly helpful. A psychology professor on YouTube talked about how people with anxiety do not get better when they get less scared. They get better when they get braver. That resonated with me, and I bought the guy's book, then started trying to get braver anytime I could. I did the things that scared me. I tried not to cower when I felt an attack coming on, but instead let it wash over me, like when you're tripping, incidentally. This helped immensely. I learned to dissociate the feelings of derealization from feelings of anxiety. If I could accept the derealization, it would not cause anxiety anymore and became more manageable. Another therapist on a podcast mentioned that people sometimes fear what they also secretly desire. I wonder if this applied to my situation. What could I desire about going crazy? It came to me immediately. People around me would care for me and help. I wondered if I was missing that in my life. I realized I had been. I won't bore you with the details, but this realization really helped me resolve some unfinished business with my parents and how we related to each other while I was growing up. This was related to my flashbacks of being a teenager as well. As I processed these feelings, I felt like I could really let them go and move on to a healthier relationship with my family. This letting go has actually stuck, and I see a contrast to some of my other family members who are perfectly willing to hold grudges for decades. Without my bad trip and whatever the hell it set off inside of me, might I still be angry with them? Finally, one of my best friends was really helpful. She has been through worse than I have by a mile and is one of those people who isn't a therapist, but really could be. She helped me talk to myself and to my inner fears in a way that helped me understand and work through them. She helped me crying in public and was one of the few people who really understood the ambivalence of the situation I was in. On the one hand, I was clearly having psychological symptoms and was not well. On the other, I could feel myself growing. I was working through some old baggage. I was learning to deal with difficult emotions and felt like I was getting stronger as a person. For the first time in my life, I began to feel like an adult instead of just a kid in an adult's body. I am comfortable calling my post-trip difficulties an anxiety disorder because that's one accurate way to describe them, but I prefer the term dark night of the soul. It encapsulates the growth as well as the suffering. Both were very clearly present. Over time, the anxiety attacks became less frequent. Something odd happened that spring though, and it was a couple of months before I had any more attacks after that. I was hiking in the forest with my boyfriend. I started to feel an attack coming, and I coped by beginning to meditate as I walked. My breath was the object of my meditation, then my body was, then the forest, then the whole world around me, and then I was the object. I left myself. The best way I can describe it is that myself was a planet, and my awareness left it and went into space. That space was made of unconditional love. There was deep, heart-wrenching compassion for the troubles I was going through. There was forgiveness, which I needed because I felt I did this to myself. There was a sense that everything would be alright and that nothing in me was fundamentally broken, which I feared very much. It must have only lasted a few seconds, but I got the sense that things would be fine for a while. I felt at peace for the rest of the day. This was completely unexpected and has not happened to me before or since in meditation. I am not even a particularly diligent meditator. Just to be clear, no drugs were involved. After that, I went 2 months without an attack. They came back that summer, sometimes triggered by stress from being on the hunt for a job. Eventually, I decided I needed to pick up and move on in my life, despite the pandemic and my anxiety issues and not finding a job I wanted. I moved to a new city in July and began an internship there. Less severe difficulties, 6 to 18 months after trip. I moved and took a job related to psychedelics, and I was surrounded by wonderful people who were interested in personal growth. Being around them helped a lot, and my symptoms lessened. The attacks were infrequent and less severe. I joined an integration course which helped me move on even more. I tried to get in with the psychologist after a particularly bad anxiety day right after I moved. That was the first and only time when I had real thoughts of wanting to die. It was scary because I felt like my suicidal thoughts were not fully in my control. Something in my brain was toying with the idea without my permission, and I felt helpless to determine whether those thoughts became more serious. But the waitlist for therapy was many months, and because I moved again in December, I never got in. Thankfully, those thoughts did not return, and though the attacks stopped, I was left with constant low-grade background anxiety. I could never fully relax or enjoy myself. It was like I was constantly conscious of how many awful things there were in the world, and I could never fully let that go. I eventually decided to take LSD again to try and work through my anxiety. I had not taken any drugs since the bad trip, but decided I wanted to do it after reading about the rebus theory of psychedelics. It seemed to precisely fit my situation, and without confronting my fears, I thought I might never truly get better. I asked an experienced friend to trip sit me and took the exact same dose of the same batch of LSD again, almost exactly 11 months after my bad trip. There was a moment in which all my emotions were personified and seated at a round table. My anxiety appeared suddenly, dark and threatening. I remembered what I had learned and invited it to the table. It shrank to the size of all the other emotions and joined them. I felt something in my mind click back into its rightful place. I did not have any anxiety problems at all for about 2 months after that, and I felt better able to accept all of my emotions, pleasant or not. When I moved for another new job 2 months later, the low-grade anxiety came back. I never had another derealization attack, but I was just an anxious person in some ways. I went to therapy to help me manage stress, and it helped a bit, but it wasn't enough. Then, about 8 months later, I decided to trip on LSD again to work through my anxiety some more. Metaphorically, my previous trip gave me a fish, but this one taught me how to fish. My anxiety appeared as a monster again, but I learned more about how it worked and what I could do to interrupt it. During the trip, I learned and practiced a particular meditation strategy. I call it loving awareness meditation, and it's not so different from loving kindness meditation, which work like an antidote to anxiety. This idea appeared to me during the trip without prompting from anything external, except perhaps the music. It worked during the trip, and it has worked ever since whenever I feel anxiety coming on. Post-trip difficulties, over 2 years after trip. In the weeks after that trip, I used my new method each time I began to feel anxious, and it always worked. Eventually, the anxiety just stopped coming. I've been completely recovered from my post-trip difficulties for about 2 years now, and am back to my old happy self. Well, not quite. That whole experience gave me a lot, and despite everything, I am grateful for it. Don't get me wrong, I think it was more painful than it had to be, and I would hope that in the future, people going through difficulties after psychedelics will have access to more support. I think I would have been spared a lot of suffering if I had been able to trust someone knowledgeable with my problems right away, or had a good community right after the trip instead of many months later. I also don't think all post-psychedelic difficulties are wellsprings of personal growth, even if mine was. But all in all, this experience is part of who I am now, and I think it helped me grow and gave me more depth as a human being. I have more empathy for others' suffering. I can more easily bear my own problems, and because I work in the psychedelic space, it is sometimes very valuable to understand the risks of psychedelics in this very personal way. I also learned the value of being able to turn to others for help and to receive it. I think that has now made me more generous with others. Most importantly, in order to bear my suffering, I had to discover a sense of meaning in my life. I had always been pretty happy, but I don't think I had a strong sense of meaning or what's really important in life before this. But my recovery was full of meaning. The meaning of life has never been more obvious to me than when I was suffering terribly, and yet could still say that I wanted to live. Every moment of life is worth living now. The world is infused with meaning, and especially with beauty, simply as it is. So if I could go back and erase that bad trip and all the suffering it brought, I would not. It has given me what I call the gift of contrast. Every day I wake up and the world is real. That's a damn good day. And that gives me strength to be there for others when they are suffering as badly as I was. I hope to give the help that I receive back to others tenfold. For some quick background, the story happened when I was 13. I am now 16, a male. Yes, I know, not a good age to be doing this stuff. This is my second ever post on Reddit. The story is kind of a slow burn and long, but I think and hope it is worth reading. This story takes place in January 2023. I had just been expelled from my middle school in 8th grade and had just begun going to a continuation school. Around this time, I was a fiend, smoking weed as much as possible, drinking whenever I could, taking whatever I could get my hands on. I remember my dad and his now ex were also very deep in addiction. I discovered a few months back that my dad was smoking meth when I walked in on him in the garage smoking out of a crack pipe in the back corner. This is a shared garage with my landlord. I remember the smell smelled like gasoline, cherry, and musty bacon chemical kind of smell. One night, a few months after discovering he smoked meth, the night this story takes place, I was home alone in my room, probably just chilling, but I didn't have any weed or anything to take. Then I remembered where I saw my dad hide the pipe. Being the low fiend I was, I decided to go try his meth. I walked down the outside stairs. The house is raised up on top of the garage, and I went to that corner of the garage and saw a black metal toolbox and opened it. Inside, I saw a bag of crystal and a pipe. The meth was a cloudy, solid white color. I shaved off a few crystals, probably a gram, and I took it upstairs. I made a pipe from an apple. I was 13, so yeah, apple. I rolled out some tobacco into the apple and took a couple shards from the bag and put it on top, lit it, and then began one of my most regrettable decisions and my worst drug experience by far. There was a second of a weird in-between feeling, a feeling of non-existence. I watched the crystals melt and smelled that familiar musty chemical smell and tasted a vile burning, yet sweet taste. And then it felt as if I rushed into another world, but it was more like I was the other world. Those few seconds were the most profound feeling seconds of my life. I kept inhaling, trying not to waste any of the meth. I ashed the one bowl very aggressively, and in a drunken kind of way, I was already fucked up. I packed another bowl, same size, and smoked. Intense euphoria washed over me as I stood up. Everything that happens next is a blur, both because of the extreme physical and mental trauma, and because this happened 3 years ago. I remember it was very cold outside, and I was shivering, but I no longer felt cold, although I continued to shiver and get goosebumps, but I could no longer feel temperature. I walked into my room and felt as though the world rotated as I stepped, feeling as if I was in a fixed position, not moving, but instead, I moved the world with my mind. I had a tunnel vision-like effect where around my peripheral there was a zooming visual as if I was flying at endless speeds. I realized why people were addicted to this stuff, but in my mind, I wasn't going to get addicted. I decided to go to the kitchen. As I did, I was walking extremely fast, but felt like I was going too slow. The meth made my brain feel like a jet engine stuck inside a Prius. I decided to run around to get some energy out, completely forgetting why I was in the kitchen. I got caught in a loop running back and forth while I tunnel visioned so hard I was practically blind. I decided since I felt like I had the infinite strength to do anything I wanted to, I would do my 10-minute workout that I would do from time to time. I started a timer and then proceeded to do my workout 3 times in those 10 minutes. I did not feel any fatigue whatsoever. In my fucked up state, I decided to text 2 people. One person was 18, I barely knew him, but he went to the continuation school I went to. I texted him a simple message that read, "Dude, I just smoked fucking meth." And the other message was to a slight friend of mine. It was a picture of the meth and in text below the picture saying, "Should I snort it?" He replied, "Yes, you should." For reference, he never touched anything but weed to this day, but still was such a dick that he told me I should. I guess I'm also a dick for doing it. I proceeded to half-ass crush the crystal in a fat line on the kitchen counter and rolled up a bill and snorted the rest. I could feel it tear through my nose, burn my lungs, and hurt in my throat, but all of the pain felt so insignificant. After all, I was on par with God, or so I thought. I ran into my room. I kept fading in and out of consciousness. I was in the kitchen, then outside, then in my room. I was shaking violently the whole time. Then I thought about how I wanted to go to sleep, and as I thought that, my dad appeared. He seemed to not notice anything at first, but then asked if I was okay. I just said yeah, I just feel kind of sick. He said, "Oh, okay," and walked away. I then threw up in my trash bag. I thought I could play it cool and handle it on my own and try and sleep it off, not understanding how fully fucked I was. It wasn't more than a minute before I threw up again, this time on the floor of the closet that led to the bathroom. I got to the toilet and threw up once more. For the next hour, I threw up every minute. My dad was comforting me at first. He brought me water and asked if I took something or what I ate. I said I ate the hot dogs in the fridge, knowing I threw them in the trash because they were expired. He went to look for them. I then told him they were in the trash. He saw them and believed me. After the first hour of throwing up, it started to slow down. I was throwing up about once every 5 minutes. At this point, my dad was no longer in the bathroom with me. He was with his girlfriend at the time, who I would call Cunty. Anytime I would ask for my dad out of fear, he would come in, ask if I needed anything, stay for a second, and then leave again, because Cunty wanted him to spend time with her or some bullshit, and he wanted to be out there with her anyway. Anytime he was in the bathroom with me, he would just have this worried look on his face and was just staring at me with his hand on my back. His face looked like it was warping and hollow. Him staring at me scared me. I would occasionally ask him to take his hand off because it was stressing me out, and then ask for it again because I felt lonely. But eventually, he just left, and I was alone for what felt like days. Although when I would look at the time, only an hour had passed. I started to feel somewhat sad, but happy and regretful in a weird way. I thought that this was brought upon me by my mom, who died when I was little. I thought maybe she was preventing me from getting addicted, but then I prayed to her. After I prayed, I felt like the devil was watching. I looked over my shoulder into the dark closet and saw a silhouette, and I got the feeling that there was 4 demons around me that wanted to kill me and make me suffer even greater. For the whole time I was in the bathroom, I would look in the shower, in the mirrors, and in the closet from my position on the floor, making sure there was no demons. Occasionally, I would hear or see something that would scare me, but I felt a protective cloak around me at the same time, gifted by God. At this time, I was atheist. But ever since this moment, I have not had a doubt that something is out there. I began to plead, saying in my head, whatever God or gods is out there, please make this stop. There was only silence and pain. I first threw up at 9 p.m. At around 11:30 p.m., I could only dry heave and throw up blood. The invincible feeling I once had turned into intense pain. My insides were on fire. I called to my dad to take me to the hospital, but he still believed I would get through it on my own. I was falling into an endless darkness of pain with a thin shield gifted by the universe that would prevent me from dying, but not prevent the pain and intense sadness. All I wanted was someone to be there with me. I wanted a friend or my dad, but worst of all, I wanted my mom. It was like she was trying to call to me, but I would never hear her cries. After 2 more endless hours of this feeling and puking, I began to throw up only once every 10 minutes. Although these were the most painful, I started to think that my throat was cut up and parts of my body were destroyed, but the 10 minutes I would have in between puking allowed me to try and go to my room to fall asleep. My dad helped me to my room and stayed with me for about 30 minutes, but I was afraid to close my eyes for too long because I thought I would puke more if I did. And when I closed my eyes, I could only feel discomfort and would have disturbing closed-eye visuals of the universe being dark and black, zooming past me and occasional faces. I was in my room, occasionally sitting up and laying back down and readjusting every minute. My brain felt like mush. My dad kept trying to calm me down and get me to fall asleep. He left the room and came back to check on me. He found me in a near unresponsive state with my eyes glazed over, barely able to talk, and then he finally decided to take me to the hospital. He would later tell me that I seemed like I was going to die if he took me even a couple minutes later. At 2 a.m., he loaded me into our beat-up truck, started it, and convinced me to drink water even if it made me puke. He went back into the house for what was only 5 minutes, but felt like an eternity. I kept throwing up water and blood in the salad bowl so much so that he had to dump it when he came back. The hospital was 20 minutes away because we were kind of far from amenities like that. Driving down the roads, all I saw was headlights and darkness. I remember saying, I don't want to die, as I looked out into the darkness, then puked more blood. The car drive felt a lot quicker than the rest of the time I'd been ODing, or whatever you want to call it, but it was the worst part. It felt like I just wanted to die at this point. It was too much to bear. But I knew I couldn't leave my family behind, so I kept fighting the urge to just pass out. Eventually, through my tunnel vision, I saw the hospital. We went straight to the ER and sat down. A nurse or someone quickly came up to us, and through blurry memories, she brought me to a table thing or counter. I remember being rude and telling her to just get me to a room already. She said they had to run a couple tests or something like that. I remember getting brought to a hall where they gave me a pill and a fancy hospital puke bag. I remember that the hospital had a very liminal, wobbly, somewhat other-dimensional feel to it. I thought this was cool and terrifying for a second. Next thing I remember, I'm in a room and I throw up the antiemetic they gave me, and my dad was sitting at the foot of the bed on his phone, and there was an IV in my arm and some other stuff. The IV had a quart of water, and to this day, was the most refreshing thing I had ever felt. I remember a nurse asking if I knew my name, birthday, and some other stuff, I think. The nurse then gave me a couple shots. A doctor came in and said he wanted to do a rainbow test. I knew this would show I had taken meth. I don't remember how they did the test, but a little while later the doctor came in with a weird demeanor, and to this day I still think he's the chillest doctor ever, or the worst doctor ever, because he says, "Well, it looks like he has acute something something," not saying anything about the meth, and looked at me with a certain expression that I understood meant he knew I took meth. I believe he did this to avoid police getting involved and making my situation a whole lot worse. After all, I was already on the brink of death. He hooked up a second IV and another nurse came in and gave me another water bag and hooked something that I don't remember what it was and pumped it into my veins. As soon as she did, I felt finally at peace, still in pain, but no more fear. No more puking, and I felt like I could speak a little easier. The stuff I was given also made me feel some weird high and much euphoria, enough so that I became very exhausted. My dad was no longer in the room. He went to his truck for something, I think for papers and to smoke a cig. While he was gone, I was fighting the exhaustion. I began to feel less euphoria from the meds. I started to sense the demons again, but they felt more distant. I knew if I fell asleep, I would die, or I wouldn't be able to leave the hospital. I still don't understand this feeling, but all I knew was falling asleep was the scariest thing that could happen in that moment. I became very agitated and restless, rolling around and twitching despite the IVs hooked up to me. My dad came back and I asked him to take me home. He said I needed to calm down because if they saw me like that, I wouldn't be discharged. Eventually, another nurse came in, checked my vitals, asked some questions, and made sure I was stable. She said I was about ready to go. She then did stuff with the IVs. I was given a prescription of something I can't remember, but I believe it was an antiemetic because it was to prevent puking. Finally, at 5:30 a.m., I was discharged. My dad helped me to the truck and I walked out with a half smile on my face, disheveled, lips chapped, and minorly bleeding, and stumbling. The next 2.5 months, I was gone. Time was fucked up. I was cutting in and out of solid consciousness. I was still shaking a lot. I was very weak because I had lost a lot of weight. All I could eat was saltines and applesauce for a week. The meds I was prescribed made me feel very loopy, but made any nausea go away without fail. I was watching TV a lot and discovered Tales from the Trip on YouTube. It wasn't until March that I went back to school. The 18-year-old guy barely knew that I texted saying I smoked meth, had told some other guys at the school. It was a continuation high school, but I was a middle schooler. There was only 2 middle schoolers, me and a kid I hated at the time, so of course they gave me shit for smoking the meth, poking fun at me and pissing me off. I then met one kid who was a tweaker and began to kick it with him, getting myself into more shit. I was still recovering until my freshman year. One decision from lack of weed, etc., a few bad choices, and about 1 gram of meth led to temporary and permanent life-changing consequences. I developed an intolerance to amphetamines. I get nausea or puke anytime I take any amphetamine. I embarrassed myself. I permanently fucked my brain. I have an intense fear of nausea. Certain smells can make me uncomfortable. My vision was fucked up for a year afterwards. Some people still bring up the meth I took, and I can't blame them, because it is truly my fault and my own stupid decisions that led to that stuff. My dad is now clean from meth. He does take stimulants and other stuff still, but no more meth. I am relatively sober. I only drink or smoke every once in a while, especially because I get anxious if I smoke or drink too much now. Sometimes I experiment with substances still here and there, especially because I haven't been in a good headspace for a while, but who has? I did eventually tell my dad that I took his meth a week after I took it when I was still recovering. He wasn't too mad, but he was remorseful. It has been almost 3 years since this incident, and I still have consequences both mental and physical, but at least I made it out alive. Others aren't so lucky. From a young age, I was always fascinated with drugs. I had heard about them from my parents, likely far too young, and I was curious what they felt like. Luckily, they weren't around me in my very early life. When I was 15, I walked upstairs after dinner one night to the strange smell in the bathroom. At the time, I obviously had no idea what the smell was, but I was curious. I asked my sister, and she told me it was weed. Instantly, a light went off in my head. No way! Actual weed? I asked her if I could try it, and reluctantly, she let me. This insane rush came over my head, and I just felt heavy and giggly. It made me feel better than I ever had before. I wish I could have known how terribly I would regret knowing this information. This story starts with me and my usual smoking buddy, let's call him Jay. Him and I probably smoked every Friday night, almost ritualistically, throughout the last year of high school. Being in the same group of friends, we were always the stoners who would get high together. These nights we smoked, Jay and I wouldn't really do much, but the night typically involved us walking to the gas station and getting snacks, then coming back and smoking in my room or something. At the time of this Friday night, our old plug had gone to jail about a week before. He was a super nice guy, and we have no idea how he got caught, but we never spoke with him again, and even 2 years later, I am still unsure about how he is doing. Us not having a plug meant that we had to use the old ask around method and try to work out who knew someone that could help us out. Eventually, we landed on this guy who neither of us had heard of before. My friend L, who recommended us to buy from him, told us that his grass was pretty good, and so we thought nothing of it. We paid $20 for 3 pre-rolls, which is decent pricing where I am, as these joints were very, very big. As we got back to my place, we unzipped the joints from their sealed Mylar bag, and I was almost immediately caught off guard. I noticed that the grass smelled sweet and dirty, almost like being on the street in front of a cookie store or something. At this point, I was experienced with weed and had smoked it relatively consistently for a year. I really should have known that this wasn't normal, but I didn't even think about it. This was my first mistake. Someone like me should have picked that up. My parents weren't home on the night that this happened, so me and Jay decided to smoke these joints, one each, on the back deck. Putting mine to my mouth, I lit the joint and took a massive puff. The smoke felt harsh and burnt my throat, and I remember feeling this dusty feeling brush across my neck internally. The smoke was yellowed and thick, not resembling the smoke of other weed I've had in the past. Within a matter of minutes, I began to notice a strange feeling come across me. Jay noticed this weird difference in the smoke as well, and whilst we were still relatively sober, we laughed about what we had smoked and the fact that it might have been bad weed. I remember saying something like, "This ain't shit," before my memory genuinely disappears. I'm incredibly scared when I think about what happened this night because I remember exactly what it was like to know that the fabric of reality itself is telling you that it is about to come out from under you. So I remember my last few moments of complete sanity, and they were spent laughing about us having smoked stems or something along the lines of that. It was already over. After a couple minutes of us smoking our joints in silence while listening to Lucky's album Free Wave, Jay and I just started talking about my family and the weird recent dynamic we had taken on. Coming from my parents believing I was a drug addict, I was, and I'm not gonna lie. In fact, I'm probably a sociopath. I have never liked them very much, so I began to do more drastic substances than my humble early weed days. But I didn't choose for this to happen. My memory cuts to each of us smoking a cigarette, and we were just shooting the shit, talking about regular stuff which really didn't mean a whole ton. At some point, I got hit with this powerful urge to tell Jay something that I saw earlier that day, but for some reason, it isn't clear to me why. I remember it being really funny and exciting. Yelling out and standing up from my chair, I yelled, "Wait, I remember what it was!" I was actually lying and was in truth trying to convince myself that I was not losing my mind. This was an inevitability that I soon accepted. It was because of this lying, though, that I believed I had been punished by the universe, as I looked at James to see he was no longer there. Suddenly, this terrible screeching comes over my ears, and the distance between me and Jay's chair meters away became millions of kilometers, and any hope in returning to normalcy had decayed, then almost instantly snapped back into it, and I stumbled back and freaked out, screaming, "What the fuck did we just smoke?" But there was no reply from Jay. The silence in the air was horrifying, and I never once throughout this entire experience felt alone. Deciding to try and change my setting being a common coping strategy for bad acid trips for me led me to move inside. I walked into the kitchen and suddenly froze and felt a gust of wind make all of the air leave my body. In a split second, I felt my entire body fizzle out into nothingness. I felt my very essence fractalize, and there were infinite iterations of myself. I could feel all of them, and the overstimulation wigged me out to such an extent I felt as though I was crying, but I couldn't cry. I felt as though I was mourning my own death, suddenly watching myself from a third-person perspective in my backyard covered in dirt and blood. Oddly enough, I wasn't entirely freaked out by the sight of this. I accepted in my own head that, well, I guess I've died, and there was nothing else to it. Without explanation, I somehow ended up in the pantry yet again with no clothes on, smothered in dirt and gashes. An intense searing pain came across my entire body at the same time. This was easily the most painful thing I have ever felt in my life, and I had no idea where this intense feeling had come from. I didn't remember what I had been doing for the past 2 hours. I didn't even know how I ended up in the pantry, better yet where all my clothes were. By far the most confusing thing at this point was how I was having these moments of periodic sobriety amongst these mind-bending blackout moments where I hardly existed. I knew inside me that something was terribly wrong, but I didn't know what to do about it. In previous bad experiences I have had with drugs, like 2CI and acid, I typically just shrug it off and accept that the time to come won't be fun. When I thought about these moments of sobriety, however, it felt like my heart sank to the floor. I'd remember hearing trip reports about people snapping in and out of lucidity whilst on the nightshade drug Datura stramonium. It also goes by the names Jimson weed, Devil's Trumpet, and others. The thought of I smoked Datura arrived, and I instantly stumbled over to the last remaining joint to confirm whether what I was thinking was rational, or if it was just a panic delusion. I had lost a significant amount of my motor coordination, so even trying to move was nauseating and difficult. My mouth was so intensely dry as well, I could barely breathe with my mouth open or else I would choke. Ripping the end of the joint open in a panic, I felt the blood rush into my face and mind. A small handful of these tiny little black seeds mixed in with some shitty looking weed fell onto the concrete. I smoked fucking Datura. My mind is racing by now. I try to hobble over to find Jay somewhere on the bottom floor of the house at this point, but he is nowhere to be seen. Amidst this panic, fully believing that my friend had died and was somewhere I didn't know, I was hallucinating very, very badly. Random people and objects would begin to appear around my house and repeat incoherent dialogue lines, expecting a response almost. A tall, looming black figure stood in the corner of the room and gestured me to leave my home. So with all the effort, I had left. I managed to get to my front door and ran outside without much coordination or success, stricken to my bones with fear. Unfamiliar creatures and weird beings were absolutely everywhere, behind trees, under my skin, in my hair, and down the street. There is quite literally nothing more mind-bending and fear-inducing than I can imagine than smoking this shit without realizing it. This vermin had completely removed me from reality, and it left me in this hellscape where everything was trying to kill me. Whilst it only felt as though I had been running for a few minutes, I was soon in a suburb I didn't recognize in the slightest. Once again, I was down to just my shorts and socks without a clue about where all my clothes had gone. The dirt and blood was still smeared all over my body. A human-dog hybrid with these enormous gnawing teeth began sprinting towards me. For those who have watched the movie The Ritual, this shit looked exactly like the monster that the movie is about. Without hesitation, I sprinted up this tree outside some random derelict house and began screaming with all my life. This sounds ridiculous, but this was the furthest thing from a joke I have ever experienced in my life. Shortly before reaching the base of the tree, this massive thing disappeared, and so did I. I simply ceased to exist, and I faded into the blur of black and gray, as though I had closed my eyes inside my head. My actual eyes were open, but I saw nothing. I regained consciousness sometime later, hearing a loud beeping in my ear. It was the familiar beep of an EKG machine. I was in a dimly lit hospital room with my mother, who was asleep on the chairs next to my bed, completely alone at 4 a.m. on a Sunday. At this point, I remembered that we had smoked this shit on Friday. Where had Saturday gone? What did I do? I honestly had no recollection, and this probably scared me the most. I will never have any idea of knowing what I did during this time period. In the hospital, I was still experiencing hallucinations and hearing auditory messages pop up around the room, feeling particular sensations across my skin as though I was being touched by someone. But, and I say but, I was at least somewhere sane. Eventually, my mother and I left the hospital some hours later with the hospital's approval. My mother never asked about the experience, and I believe the hospital would have told my mother what I was on, as I never did. I felt completely out of it for the following 4 days, and it took almost a week to feel completely normal again. I still have horrific nightmares about that night nowadays, and some of the visions I saw will never leave my constant memory. I wrote about my experience with Datura as a cautionary tale. Never, ever, ever smoke something unless you know for sure what it is. Roll your own joints if you need to, just to make sure that this or a similar thing doesn't happen to you. That drug dealer ruined my fucking life, and I will never escape the absolutely mind-bending horror of smoking this drug. Never ever touch this evil poison. I can promise that you will never feel or be the same again. Here we go, folks. Yet another woe be upon you horror story of meth abuse, inevitably ending up in death or tragedy. However, this is a little different. I'm trying to stay away from words like evil and sinister. I'd like to point out to a few that it is grammatically incorrect to use subjective value judgment adjectives when referring to inanimate nouns. I am not innocent. I've been known to mutter demon-like accusations at my computer quite often, and my grammar is a far step from perfect. Okay, I'll now step away from my role as Miss Anal Retentive Grammar Police to get to my main story, which thankfully does not concern the past subjunctive or prepositional phrases. Since the age of 14, I had experimented more and more frequently with the variety of drugs. I had and have always had a drive for knowledge, so I entered that world armed with an encyclopedic knowledge of pharmaceuticals and illegal drugs of every kind, an information bank that serves me well to this day. I tried meth for the first time at a rave where a girl coming with my friends and I whispered in my ear that she had some speed. She asked if I would like to try it, and in my state of general melancholy and apathy, I said yes. After swallowing a good-sized lump of what I now realize was extremely pure speed, I spent a lovely night socializing and dancing until the sun came up, proceeding to crash at my best friend's house. I spent an hour before the sleeping pills kicked in, marveling at my feelings of clarity and energy, levels of which I had never felt before. You know, the usual. Great first experience, energy and euphoria, the best thing ever. Anyway, we drove back to school the next morning, and for the next few weeks I occasionally did a tiny line at the baggie I had left over. I forgot about it, although I had a great time, and came home from boarding school for Thanksgiving break. I should have put the brakes on right then and there. I am manic depressive and should have realized the danger in mixing illegal drugs with my impressive array of medications. One of my best friends there drove me to her dealer's house after I told her about my first time on meth. She was an old user and introduced me to smoking meth. I loved it instantly. When I was younger, I saw my brother go through awful meth addiction, an addiction that tore my family apart forever and left 2 friends dead. All those memories floated from my head as I inhaled the white vapor, feeling a sense of serenity, clarity, and lightness. This time will be different. I'll never get addicted. This was my mantra as I arrogantly supposed myself to be different from all the other hacks who tried meth for the first time. My use was infrequent but regular, smoking a little 1 or 2 times a week. Months passed, my grades were great, my social life was thriving, my art was more and more creative, and my life was overall great. I was finally living up to my harsh parents' impossible demands of academic and physical perfection. I lost weight and bore myself confidently for the first time. All good things go bad. My use went up to a few times a week, to every day, to a few times a day, to constantly, anywhere I could find a bathroom or chill in my dorm room. I still was pretty together and never faced the ugly come down due to my strange body chemistry. I have the kind of body where I can smoke over a gram of crystal, then eat a meal and go to sleep. I don't really have withdrawals and my body gives no stop signs, no warnings, a dangerous trait susceptible to overdose. So I did it all the time, never coming down. By that time, I was addicted, buying constantly with stolen and lent money, sneaking out from school at night to meet my dealer in the woods. I sat on my bed all day after classes, locked in an embrace with my pipe. I began to get paranoid, thinking that even my friends knew everything and were out to bust me. I lost more and more weight, getting down to under 115 pounds at 5 foot 9 inches. Sad thing was, my skeletal appearance was complimented and pined over. I had modeled when I was younger, and once again I was back to the anorexic look of an emaciated model. Every girl in the school asked me constantly for diet advice. This is one of the greatest sources of my sorrow when I look back over these years. Another testament to a society so distorted and delusional that my drug-addled body was considered the ideal. Meanwhile, my psychosis increased until a night where I spent hours hallucinating people outside and imagining alarms going off from imaginary smoke. That night scared me, and I quit for a few days. Then I just started again. By that time, it was obvious to my friends that something was seriously wrong with me. A best friend of mine confronted me, accusing me of being on speed. At first, violently denying it, I eventually broke down and told him everything, including my slowly emerging sense of the nature of my drug use. Reality gave me a swift kick in the ass a few days later when my roommate ratted me out and I was kicked out of school. My furious parents sending me straight to rehab and the hardcore wilderness program Ascent. Going home, I ran straight back into my lover's arms, only to spiral back into addiction, this time worse, ending up with admission to the ER with a severe heart murmur or something of the sort. I was sent back to rehab, came back a lot saner, and went back to my junior year at school. I can't describe to you the horror of my relapse. My first experience, so awful at the time, was cake compared to my second one. To summarize, at my worst, I had run away from home and was in my second week of homelessness, begging during the day for enough money for a fix. Eventually finding a friend with a small dirty drug den of an apartment in the middle of the ghetto. I spent days and days in the same spot on the couch, flirting just enough with my dealer to get free 8 balls and grams. I did nothing but smoke meth. I stayed awake for days and once ate nothing for 5 days. I watched people sitting on the dirty cement floor shooting up heroin, and I felt no emotion, no shock. No reality touched me. Withdrawal finally showed itself to me, hours where I screamed and scratched at my skin, begging anyone I could find, going back to my house to steal possessions and pawn anything I found. At that point, you don't give a shit. Drugs are not evil, but their abuse takes away all your self-control and dignity. I look back on those 3 weeks and thank God I didn't start shooting up or sleep with someone for drugs. That's all I can say about my dignity. I was finally arrested and taken home to my family. I spent some time at a local rehab center. After having difficulty in exhibiting symptoms of schizophrenia, I was admitted to a mental institution where the remaining shreds of my dignity were systematically taken from me. Following my commitment, I returned to the Ascent program, this brutal 4-week odyssey through the Colorado mountains resulting in an 105-degree flu and a few weeks in the hospital after my heart had more problems. I can honestly say that half year was hell, lying on the clean vinyl of a loony bin, forcibly shot up with Thorazine. You have some alone time to realize how immensely you fucked up. But things got better. Over months, I was improving. My body was healing, and my moods had stabilized. Things were looking great. I was clean, healthy, happy, and doing well at school. But, like in a Hollywood film about evil drug addicts played by attractive starlets, things changed for the worse. I should have been strong. I should have thought about all the things I was throwing away. But I couldn't really say no when my friend offered me a line of coke for the first time. 1 led to 2, 2 led to a shitload. It was like I had never gone to rehab and never entered a therapist's room. I started using instantly, cheating on my frequent drug tests at home while on Christmas break. I became a typical cokehead, partying, doing lines like eating candy, having fabulous coke sex, and denying reality in general. Once again, I dropped heinous amounts of weight in just 1 or 2 weeks, and became violent, getting in physical fights with my parents. And then the inevitable happened. I fucked up a drug test, fake, and tested positive for coke. I can only imagine how devastating this was for my parents, who, despite their harsh rule, care a lot about me. It was rehab again, and then many days of therapy and speculation on my ability and fitness to go back to school for my senior year. The summer was spent sober, accepting a discreet joint in Amsterdam, and thinking a whole lot. I admitted to myself for the first time that I had a serious problem, one that wasn't going away without my help. By the end of the summer, I felt pulled together enough to start school. Thank God for my intensely rational side, a conscience strong enough to keep me clean for a crucial year before my year of college. My savior was Ritalin, my daily 108 milligrams going straight up my nose as the only thing that makes me give a shit anymore. My family is falling apart, and I'm dealing with the death of two best friends from overdose and DWI. The mania and depression that I so skillfully evade taunt me from an ever-approaching distance. I grow tired of parents who only say I love you when you bring home a perfect GPA or SAT scores. I am tired of my sanity being governed by a handful of daily pills, but know that living in the midst of a hallucination is twice as painful. My bones hurt as if my skeleton is being pulled apart due to a form of osteoporosis, early onset, a condition brought about from anorexia due to years of meth and cocaine use. I wonder if my chemistry is permanently altered. I've seen the brain scans, and I know it is. I wish I could say I'll never touch coke or meth again, even on my unsupervised year off, after seeing the pale shadows of my 60-year-old bones and the darkened spots on my brain, but I can't even make that promise. I wonder often what life was like before drugs and before schizophrenia or manic depression. I often daydream about perfect happiness, a feeling I remember only in my old apartment in Rome, where I lived for most of my childhood before moving to the United States of America. That was August. I'm home for break from school, and my super complex sure victory battle plan is to live day to day and to try to funnel the endless stream of thoughts that distracts me from even simple conversation. Each day I face the reality of the world I have carved for myself and the agony of beginning to heal. I already feel stronger, a little more sure of myself. I critiqued earlier this trivial bit of language, not to point out a mistake, but to bring attention to a certain state of mind found so commonly in the world of drugs. This report focuses on my struggles with methamphetamine and cocaine addiction, its preface and prologue, the aftermath of a storm. I am also taking this write-up as a chance to express a few ideas about addiction and the human psyche that have remained unsaid for many years, stewing and evolving in their captivity. Back to the point, get used to detours. Addiction is just one of the scourges upon our country. The way politicians talk about it, it seems to be equal to the fall of the Iron Curtain of communism upon our beloved country. There is a stigma to this day on the subject of addiction and drugs in general. Our culture's obsession with movies depicting drug abuse and the horrible demise of housewives and teenagers gone wrong is evidence of the fear, aversion, and curiosity the average American citizen holds towards the subject. We can live out our sick little fantasies through beautiful but tragic Hollywood actresses who have probably never touched meth in their charmed lives. So when our culture and government is confronted with this growing problem of drugs and drug abuse, no one really knows what to do but lock them up, along the same lines of our treatment of mental patients. There exists the sentiment that we've come a long way as a society, and we are approaching a harmonious, educated, and open-minded utopian version of life. There are a few things in our way, and instead of doing things the hard way, i.e. trying to understand the complexities and psychology of addiction and mental illness, we prefer to push these issues away into the back of our prisons and the back of our minds. Even politicians are wary of these topics and try to stick to safe things like Social Security and taxes and elections and debate. So when we are fed this image of drug addicts as demons and menaces of freedom by society, most people emerge with that same mindset, a sterile and awful image of drugs and the drug addict. Even drug addicts call their addiction a disease, which brings me back to the labeling of drugs as evil or malicious. Both the labeling of addiction as a responsibility-shirking illness and drugs as beings, we succumb to a simplification of values endorsed by society. It is easy for me to look back over years of drug use, rehab, and mental confinement and funnel my fear, regret, and anger into methamphetamine or cocaine. It makes me feel like I'm a little less responsible, a little less crazy. basically putting labels on anything is a cop-out. After realizing this, I have ceased to simplify and blame, wallow in self-pity, and indulge in misguided anger. I have spent the last few months picking apart my psyche, trying to understand every facet of my addiction and mental illness, as it is called when a mind deviates from the norm. It is painful and has required my admitting of a serious problem that I would rather not acknowledge. I recommend you all to go inward instead of outward and begin the painful process of healing to begin by confronting your own reasons for demonizing a drug. What do you fear in yourself? What do you have nightmares about? What are you most frightened of concerning drugs? Would you go back and change things? Start taking responsibility by questioning every one of your old assumptions. Bear the pain of tearing open old wounds to stitch them up correctly. I know I'm trying, and it's a painful, awful process that some days is simply impossible. Some days I fuck up. I've relapsed. I've done things I shouldn't after time and time again of second chances and mistakes. Some days I'm okay, and some days I'm not. It seems recently that there are more of the latter than the former. When Jane Doe, conservative right-winger, watches anti-drug propaganda, she knows well the image of the infamous drug user. He is homeless, track marks evident, eyes violent and psychotic, hands just ready to strangle you for drug money. He is a scourge to society, a bit of unsightly dandruff. Jane Doe, meet X. She is an honor roll student since 6th grade. Community service means a lot to her, so she spends considerable time at the Audubon Center and local senior citizen homes. She dresses well and has long, glossy black hair. X wears no makeup and pulls her hair back neatly into a bun. She is never late to class and just scored a perfect verbal on her SATs. Along with her GPA, her scores put her in the running for schools like Harvard and Stanford and Columbia, a place she has dreamed of going to since middle school. An educated and literate Democrat, she reads Rousseau in her free time and can hold her own in any political debate. She is her parents' pride and joy and loves to go skiing and hike with her family, who would describe her as an eccentric and creative perfectionist. X is the face of our generation. She is one of our many voices, a natural leader, eager to change things in the world. X is also a chronic drug addict. Under her crisp cotton sleeves are the faded dots of old track marks, and her skirt conceals a hip structure breakable with a small stumble. X has smoked so many chemicals her lungs have trouble inhaling and have permanently lowered their capacity. X is the new breed of addict, a deceiving example of the youth and their many emerging problems. I feel so weak as X. I feel like a number, a cog, and a distraction. I am left behind and ignored by the system, and life seems harder and harder these days. I am a pariah. I am taboo. I am untouchable beneath this surface of middle-class normality. I am the embarrassing love child of the new American society, and I must eventually be dealt with. I hope I grow up to help this change happen. I hope one day I can live a day without thinking about the descriptive quality-free substances that have been such forces of change in my life. I can honestly say it was the best and worst thing that ever happened to me. Just be careful, please. Stop this cycle before it starts. I don't know about you guys, but that whole last section, I had my eyes rolling the entire time. The other night I dosed 2 caps of 2CI, 10 milligrams each. The plan was to go up to a rave, but this plan slowly fell apart over the next hour as people came through with the normal excuses of, I'm too tired or I have no money. So it seemed I'd have to spend the trip in my mate's lounge, which was fine considering there was music, a bong, a TV, and a few other good trip items. Slowly, people started going to bed, and by this time, I was tripping extremely hard, way harder than my other 20 milligram 2CI experiences. There were a few nitrous canisters around, so me and a friend started hitting these. This is where my memory starts to go, but I vaguely remember getting stuck in the NOS world for a lot longer than balloons are meant to last. I remember feeling more and more terrified as I lay and hugged my friend who was sitting next to me on the couch watching TV as normal. I was getting horrible zombie movie-style gory visions in my head, and this only added to the fear. This is where it all goes wrong. I can't really remember much of the next few hours, and my only clear, concise memory after being on the couch is waking up in a hospital a few hours later with 2 policemen at the foot of my bed, as well as my best friend who stayed by my bed the whole time. Thank God for him. From what I'm told, my friend who I was with on the couch got up to make some food, and when she got back, I was pouring sweat, breathing really, really heavily, and screaming about how I was going to die. I then proceeded to run around the house trying to escape or unalive myself and became very, very violent. I remember having the thought that I'd done something terrible and everyone in the world was trying to kill me, even my family and friends, and that I needed to unalive myself quickly before they could drag it out in some horrible way. I tried to jump out of a window, was biting and scratching myself until I bled. Luckily, my mates removed all sharp objects from the room. Tried to run away over next door's fence with the idea that I could somehow get away and throw myself off somewhere or something. Somewhere during all of this, a mate called an ambulance and the police turned up as well. The next thing I know, I wake up in a hospital, still tripping stupidly hard, still with the paranoid ideas from earlier. I had, however, been sedated, so I couldn't really act on my ideas except cry my eyes out. These ideas slowly subsided over the next few hours, and I became able to talk and became a lot calmer. None of the doctors, nurses, or police officers had ever heard of 2CI, and from what I can gather from their questions, they know very little about the current drug scene. From the hospital, I was transferred by a police van to a cell as I'd been sectioned under the Mental Health Act, and they needed to interview me. Luckily, I hadn't actually committed any crime. So I arrived at the police station and was told to wait in a cell until the psychiatrist was available. After a short while, he came in but was unable to interview me as I was still tripping balls. So they left me in the cell for a few hours where I had some coffee and a sandwich and lay down for a while. Slowly, the visuals subsided and they were able to interview me. After that, I was let go. After this, I've decided to quit all drugs, as the distress that night has caused my friends and family is too much for me to ever risk putting them in that situation. I smashed their flat-screen TV, kicked a door down, and somehow broke the barbecue. It took 4 police officers to restrain me, and I'm covered in cuts and bruises, mostly on my hands where it seems I punched a lot of things. The worst part, however, is the worry I put my parents through that day, and the distressing night I gave my friends, as well as all the damage. One friend said after the incident it was the single most terrifying thing she had ever seen. Luckily, the ones I've spoken to are still willing to talk to me. I'm not entirely sure what happened that night, as I've tripped hundreds of times before on all sorts of chemicals and in higher doses than this, even had some bad trips, and never have I ever come close to anything like that. It feels like I took on a completely different personality, ceased being myself and became a complete madman. It feels more like a psychotic break than a bad trip.
After an extremely powerful experience smoking DPT freebase, I recently decided to experiment with an alternative route of ingesting this novel material. My patron had also provided me with some of the hydrochloride salt, and I chose to try insufflation this time. I had inadvertently taken considerably too much of the material when I had experimented with smoking it, so I decided to be more cautious this time, laying out only 100 milligrams of the fine white powder into 2 short lines, even though I had been encouraged to try 150. After grounding and centering myself by meditating for a while, I rolled up a crisp, new $20 bill and inhaled 50 milligrams up each nostril. Thankfully, there was no burn to speak of, although as the material hit the back of my throat, I experienced some extremely medicine-y tasting post-nasal drip. I cleared my palate with a sip of a beverage I had standing at the ready for this purpose and lay down upon my bed to await the onset of effects. There was a latency period of about 5 minutes or so, after which I felt a warm, glowing ball of energy begin to form around my genital area, which became highly sensitized. This felt extremely pleasant and very erotic. Over the next several minutes, I felt the energy travel up my spine like an electrical current. Eventually, it seemed to terminate at a center in my head, and when it did so, I started to experience the full visionary effects of DPT. High-resolution, brilliantly colored images were seemingly downloaded at a frantic pace into my sensorium. The content of the visions was hard to keep up with, as the transmission seemed somewhat choppy, but there was an overall futuristic, science fiction-like theme to them. I saw outlandish images of non-human, bizarre creatures and strange, apparently alien landscapes projected onto the insides of my eyelids. Unlike my DMT experiences, there was no urgent sense of presence attached to these visions. I was definitely an observer rather than a participant in what I was seeing. I found it rather hard to stay focused on the visionary content of the experience, however, because of some rather distressing physical effects that began to manifest at about the same time. As soon as the energy traveling up my spinal cord reached my head, I began experiencing bodily shivering, which soon gave way to very forceful shakes and began to approach the level of full-out convulsions. My limbs were flailing about and my body was jerking around uncontrollably all over my bed. I tried as hard as I could to breathe through it and relax into whatever was going on, but I was pretty scared by this and couldn't escape the feeling that I might have put myself in danger of serious physical harm. My breathing became rapid and shallow, my head was whipping back and forth from side to side, and I held on for dear life, hoping that it would pass quickly. At about the 40-minute point, the convulsions gratefully subsided and the visual effects also began to diminish in intensity. By the hour point, things had tapered down into a very euphoric afterglow, with no real visions to speak of, just a nice, warm, opened-up, emphatogenic buzz. This was nearly identical to the after phase I had experienced when smoking the freebase and lasted for the next 3 hours or so. While I feel grateful to have had the opportunity to work with this rare and novel compound, I would be very hesitant to explore it further due to the extremely distressing nature of the physical side effects that I encountered during the experiment. The convulsions that I experienced were sufficiently strong to make it nearly impossible to make constructive use of the visionary state that DPT made available to me, not to mention pretty terrifying as well. I would advise a high degree of caution when working with DPT and strongly recommend having a sitter present should these physical effects happen to manifest. In my own final analysis, however, there are plenty of other materials out there that open up similar enough spaces without these distracting somatic symptoms to leave me relatively uninterested in pursuing this avenue of exploration any further. I don't know if you want me to read the rest of this stuff, so I'm just gonna go ahead and go through the rest of the page. Citation, Trey. A rip snortin' rough ride, an experience with DPT. Dose 100 milligrams. Insufflated. DPT freebase. Experience year 1999. Gender male. Age at time of experience not given. Published June 15th, 2000. And I can't imagine you'd need the rest of that. So yeah, thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
I had been messing around with psychedelics for about 2 years prior to this experience, and I was very strongly craving that deep spiritual experience you read about everywhere. So much that I was willing to take ridiculous amounts of a substance just to get there. I had some experience with 2Cs, LSD and DMT before, but nothing mind-blowing to say the least. I had tried 4-ACO DMT once before, 10 milligrams, and had a very relaxing, controlled experience, but I was still missing that cosmic awakening I kept reading about. So I loaded up about 50 milligrams of 4-ACO DMT on a scale, dissolved it in some water, and swallowed it. So far so good. A little nervous, but I was sure I could handle it. I was surprised to feel it kicking in within 5 minutes of taking it. Last time it took at least 45. I started to get a bit worried, so I went online only to have it remind me that 50 milligrams was considered an extremely large dose. That got the anxiety going. Within 10 minutes, I'm sitting there with a racing heart, and I'm noticing black spots appearing all over my vision. Noticeable open eye visuals like I had never seen before. I threw on my jacket and was about to spend my next few hours outside like I had planned. Unfortunately, as soon as I stood up, I realized this was impossible. I was way deeper than I thought I would be, and it's only been a few minutes so far. This was supposed to last for a full 6 to 7 hours. I realized quickly I was in trouble and that there was absolutely nothing I could do to stop it. It was going to happen. I couldn't get it out of my head, and that was that. So I lay down on my bed, turned off the lights and prepared for the madness that was about to engulf me. The next hour or two were composed mostly of me trying to hold on to my sanity and remain aware of where and what I was, as I felt these two simple constants already being torn away from me. All of my thoughts were modified, distorted, pulled, stretched, and illustrated to me in immense hyperdimensional visuals too complex to describe. I was extremely afraid, mostly because I didn't know how much deeper I would be pulled in, and because I was painfully aware that there was no eject button I could pull to save myself when things were getting too dark. It was at this point that I realized there was no way to fight it, and I had to surrender myself completely. So I stopped all resistance, cleared my mind, and just lay there hoping I would somehow just pass out and wake up in the morning as sober as ever. Somewhere during this time that I was laying there, the experience peaked. Reality melted away from me completely. Hands, feet, face, body, my bed and blankets were all but a distant memory. I was just a ball of energy, floating out there somewhere drowned out in waves of energy. At a point I realized that I was dead. My body was gone. I was gone. There was just the energy that used to be me. For a while I was afraid of my death. I wanted to go back. I wanted to live. Then I realized that there was no way to go back after seeing what I saw and feeling what I felt. I couldn't fit into the world anymore. I had to be pushed out. With these thoughts, I accepted my death. Everything felt calm and silent. My mind stopped racing, and all the black and white energy around me swirled together to make an even shade of grey. It was incredibly peaceful. It's very hard to write out the experience after this time. There is a fundamental difference between knowing and understanding, and although I could attempt to make others know what I felt, it is impossible to make anyone understand. Sometime later, I realized that I was slowly coming down. It was an incredible moment of relief, and euphoria filled every inch of me. I was not out of the woods yet. At times I would forget everything I knew and become blissful and ignorant. Then I would slowly become aware of where and what I was, and I would get tired of the state I was in, and then I would slowly slip back into nothingness and become ignorant again. It was a process of rebirth that cycled over and over again, far more times than I can remember. Slowly I found myself laying in my bed, squirming around and laughing. For the first time in hours, I was able to open my eyes and saw my ceiling, which was still squirming and morphing above me. I felt my hand and raised it. It felt like it was at least a few hundred miles long. I couldn't count how many fingers I had, but just the fact that I was able to see them filled me with joy. I laughed and laughed, and after about an hour, I was sober enough to stand up and take a shower. By far, one of the most incredible and horrifying experiences of my life. Much more than I ever expected or desired.
Full-blown blackout. Clonazepam by Base Junkie. I decided to take some clonazepam on a Sunday night to help me go to bed and relax after a long day. I started with 1 milligram sublingually and moved up in my dose over time. I remember quite fondly that I took 3 milligrams more sublingually and 1 milligram insufflated with nasal spray. The night of this experience, I remember being relaxed, but not quite satisfied with the high, which is the reason for the redosing. Eventually, I ended up falling asleep, which I have no recollection of at all, and then begins the next morning. Most of these events are from what I was told, and not things I actually recall. I was scheduled for work around 8 a.m. I had set my alarms the night prior, but they didn't wake me up. My grandma, who I was living with, had to wake me up one way or another, and immediately after waking up, I was already blacked out. I was unable to walk properly, and even one of my other relatives, who has dementia, noticed something was wrong. I was supposed to borrow my grandmother's car, as my car was in the shop, and upon asking for the keys, she denied me them and questioned my sobriety, in which case, I claimed I was totally fine and had no idea what she was talking about. I then walked outside for no apparent reason, in which she questioned what I was doing, and I simply replied, "I don't know." I then crawled back up the stairs to the house and got frustrated. I went into my room and quite literally screamed at the top of my lungs and banged my head several times against the wall. Grandma then came into my room and we had an argument which I can't fully remember the details of. A bit later, I called out of work and left a 3-minute voicemail for my manager. I really don't know how I was competent enough to get his number in this state, as it's not in my contacts, and according to another coworker, blatantly slurred my words and claimed that the AC compressor in my car blew up, which is the reason for my absence. I then texted him and claimed I had the flu basically right after, which made him mad that I claimed 2 different things. Some other things must have happened before I went back to bed. There were several call logs in my phone after calling out from work, which I didn't recognize. There are probably some other events that happened too. For example, I believe my grandmother mentioned that I went into the shower at some point. It's unknown to me if I actually took a shower or not, amongst other various degenerate actions. It's been a couple days now since this experience, and I'm just thankful that I have suffered no repercussions from this experience other than pure embarrassment from working home. I still live with my grandma and was able to play it off as if it was some kind of mental episode. Surprisingly, my manager did not mention any of this upon my return, and things continued as normal. This is probably because I work in a car dealership, and obviously, shit like this isn't the most unlikely thing to occur, albeit still uncommon. I really think I lucked out, because had my car not been in the shop, I could have drove myself to death, as I was at the time fully convinced I was sober. Or I could have made it to work and made a fool out of myself even more than I had with that voicemail. It was really lucky timing that I learned this lesson now and not in a situation where I could have put myself or others in serious danger. Overall, I still like this drug and will continue to do it, but not at my grandmother's house, and certainly not the day before an early shift at work. I refuse to let myself have an experience like this again. Even typing this is hard, because of how embarrassing it is, and how ashamed I am of my actions. I made the foolish mistake of underestimating the potency of this drug, and suffered some embarrassment as a result. I am fortunate enough to be able to put this behind me, with relatively no long-term or life-changing consequences. With time, this will fade and be forgotten about, especially considering I will not repeat these actions. It'll be like it never happened. Anyway, moral of the story is, be careful with this shit, and don't do it the day before you have to go to work.
I was at a festival camping for the weekend and we're planning on finding some LSD. It was a super small festival, and for the first time in my life I couldn't find some for the life of me. I was with my buddy and his girlfriend for the weekend. At that time they both had issues with Percocet. We were really bummed and my boy says I got that vial of DOB with me. I become instantly interested and ask him if he's tried it. He said he had tried it and it didn't work. He said he took a hit and it didn't really do much to him, so I said, well, we might as well try it. Now what happens next was one of the worst experiences of my life. The kid he got it from was my buddy's brother. He didn't know too much about it. He said there was around 8 doses in the vial. He hands me it, and I was thinking that it was really weak or something and I just had to take a larger dose. I squeezed the dropper and got it a little more than half full. Instantly, without hesitation, dropped it on my tongue. My buddy wasn't paying attention and then looked at me right as I was dropping it. The look on his face was filled with such fear and concern. I will never forget it as I spit what hadn't absorbed into my hand. It was like half a shot full. I instantly knew I had really fucked up. He starts telling me that this stuff can be lethal in high doses, and obviously I began to panic. I asked him, "Am I gonna die?" He was like, "I don't know, dude, that was a lot." He grabs the vial from me because he wanted to make sure him and his girl still had enough to get high after I basically ingested almost half of what was in the vial. We start discussing how dumb I am, and they decide they want me to do a couple 30mg Percocet. I didn't do any, obviously. I wasn't trying to take anything else. About 20 to 30 minutes passed, and all of a sudden, I start feeling a burning in the back of my neck, like right where my spine meets my head. I now knew for sure that this stuff wasn't bunk and I could be in trouble. I started getting violently hot and had to blast the air conditioning in my car. I started going from hot to cold over and over, sweating profusely to the point where my shirt was wet and then I would get super cold, blasting the AC for 5 minutes and then the heat for another 5 minutes. Then my buddy decides he wants to do his thing and starts crushing up his Percocet. I can tell that I'm coming up very hard and it's gonna be super strong because I hadn't even started tripping yet, and I was having body spasms and shit as well. About 5 minutes after my buddy sniffs the Percocet, both him and his girlfriend puked. We were about 30 to 45 minutes into this, and I was starting to trip, so I thought it might be from the DOB, and I'm really fucked. They had taken like 4 hits after me each. I start chugging Gatorades from the back seat, trying to keep up with this constant terrible burning in the back of my neck. I drank like 6 or 7 bottles in like 20 minutes. I start to trip/roll super hard, like blackout hard. I only remember a few pieces from the whole experience. It was a super dark trip and really hard to see anything at all. Finding the bathroom was a huge ordeal. I literally couldn't speak English anymore and would mutter these ridiculous dumb things, and I was speaking straight gibberish. I was lost in this nightmare trip for 3 days straight. I couldn't drive yet on Sunday because I was still high. I truly thought I wasn't going to come back to normal. I thought I was going to be stuck in that dumbass state for the rest of my life and be a vegetable. For 3 days I had these thoughts, truly fearing for my life through most of it. If anything, I take it as a life lesson, just a real hard one. I feel very grateful for being alive after. They say whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and I agree wholeheartedly. I believe I grew from this experience, but I probably also endured some irreversible brain damage. I chalk it up to being young and dumb. I hope somebody can learn from this experience and not have to go through that hell.
Seizures and other problems. An experience with 6-APB and MXE. This is a report about some decidedly unpleasant effects from using 6-APB repeatedly in combination with a few other substances for about a week. For the most part, we were not measuring our doses of MXE or 6-APB, we just did lines or took gel caps whenever we felt like it. Overall, we were paying a bit more attention to the MXE dosage since it's more potent than the phenethylamine. Besides these RCs, we were vaporizing cannabis and drinking. We followed this regimen for about a week, but before the end we ran out of MXE and began drinking a lot less, so that we were basically just using large amounts of 6-APB. Towards the end of this week, things began to get a bit strange. First, we lost all senses of place. The room we were staying in seemed to us to be located in a completely different building, on a different floor, on an entirely different street of the city. Even the layout of the rooms and the rest of the apartment seemed entirely new and different when we weren't occupying them. The only other time anything like this ever happened to either of us, as a result of drug use, or for any other reason for that matter, was from taking lots of Adderall, continually, for 4 days in a row, but the 6-APB's version of this effect was much more pronounced. Perhaps this was some kind of phenethylamine-induced delirium, but I shouldn't speculate. Next came the seizure-like effects. I had trouble swallowing water, my throat would clench every time I took a gulp, so it was difficult to drink anything. My wife began to experience a different sort of negative effect. Whenever she would blink too rapidly, she experienced an aura like that which had preceded amphetamine-induced seizures in the past. She had to hold her eyes shut in order to alleviate it. At the end of our delirious week, we ran out of 6-APB, and this is when the sleep problems began. The partial seizures, self-diagnosed admittedly, which preceded sleep, were the most unnerving negative effects I experienced. As I would begin to drift off, I would suddenly become very much awake, but unable to move, with a vision from the dream which had been beginning, fixed in my mind. I would be unable to think of anything else or to move any part of my body for what seemed like 30 seconds. This would happen repeatedly whenever I tried to fall asleep, for maybe 2 nights following the cessation of the 6-APB. These experiences were thoroughly unnerving, and I would not want to experience anything like them again.
Coming to terms with death. I had acquired 25C from someone a few days before this experience. Prior to this, I had experimented with one other research chemical, 2CB. I went into this experience thinking the effects would be similar to 2CB, but found something completely different and unique, and much more psychedelic. At around 5 p.m. on this day, I started by taking half of a 1 mg tab. I had it in my mouth for about a half hour. Then I started eating and realized I had swallowed the tab. After dinner, I went to a house party with a friend. It had been about 2 hours since I first put the tab in my mouth, and I was feeling minimal effects, just a little bit of euphoria. When we got to the party, I put a whole milligram tab into my mouth. I walked around the party for a while and noticed it was a lot easier to talk to people, just like on MDMA. I was feeling very euphoric and happy. This went on for about 2 or 3 hours. But I wasn't having any visual hallucinations. About 10 p.m., I went to the bathroom and flushed the used tab, then put 1 more milligram tab in my mouth. About half an hour after I put this tab in, I was seeing things that started to warp around me. It was very similar to the visuals on 2CB. Things were floating and moving slowly. It was nice, but nothing really intense. At about 11 p.m., I went outside to smoke some weed with my friends. We had rolled a really large blunt. I didn't pay attention to exactly how much was in it, but I suspect it was about 3 grams. I hadn't smoked for about a month prior to this, so my tolerance was very low. I was taking very big hits off of it and started to get very high. My friend turned on some really slow music, and it made me start to feel really floaty and trip out. This is when things started getting intense. We were outside for about a half an hour, and then I really started tripping and told my friends I had to go inside and lay down. I felt really disconnected from the world. Every time I turned my head, it was like I was seeing a brand new landscape altogether. Each direction of sight was its own world. I started to get really scared, so we went inside and I lay down on a couch in a room that nobody was in. I told my friends I just wanted to be alone, so they left. I started to see very vivid shapes everywhere. It was like I was looking at everything through a colorful grid of circles and triangles. My body started to get really tingly in certain places, and I started to twitch a little bit, like my first time smoking weed. If I stared at one thing for a long time, it started to become the only thing in existence, and I started to see it in tunnel vision. After I was in the room for a couple minutes, I started to get really scared and started thinking I took too much of the 25C. I sat up because I needed to get my head straight. Everywhere I looked was just so vivid with shapes. I stood up and walked in the bathroom that was connected to my room and went pee. I looked at myself in the mirror of the bathroom for a long time, just talking to myself, trying to come to terms with just how hard I was tripping and what was going on. Eventually I came to the idea that there was a good chance I was going to die that night. I felt very strongly that what I was feeling was what people feel before they die. I kept looking at myself thinking, I'm going to die. I'm going to die. It was extremely scary. I went and lay back down on the couch, just staring at the ceiling, which was moving around, warping, and covered in shapes and colors. It was when I closed my eyes that things got very intense. When I would close my eyes, it was like my entire body was covered in an abyss of darkness. It felt like I was not in a room in a friend's house. It felt like I was just in the middle of this black abyss. It felt like I was sinking into the blackness. It felt like I was sinking down into the earth. Then when I opened my eyes, I returned to the couch and kept tripping more. I started getting really afraid again and thinking I was probably dying. Then I started getting really paranoid about the people outside the room, thinking everyone in the house knew what I was doing and was worried about me. I started thinking people were calling 911. Every time I heard someone's voice, I thought they were talking about me. Every time I heard the front door open, I thought it was the paramedics coming upstairs to get me. I kept having these thoughts for a good hour. It was a completely terrifying experience. Eventually, I just needed to relax. When I closed my eyes this time, I went inward and looked at myself very introspectively. I felt like I was looking at myself as though I was standing inside my body, looking at me from the inside. I started becoming aware of who I truly was and what I was capable of. I started asking myself questions, but not really needing to know the answers. After that, I really needed to get comfortable and relax because it felt like my heart was beating very fast and I didn't think I was breathing good enough. At this point, time was completely non-existent. I had no concept of time, so my breathing was very hard to keep control of because I couldn't tell how many seconds were in between each breath. Eventually, I turned on a guided meditation on my phone and closed my eyes. This was the most peaceful thing ever. Between hearing this meditation and also having on the forefront of my mind the thought that I was going to die soon, it was the most amazing loss of ego I have ever felt. Shortly after this, I went to sleep. The next day I woke up feeling changed. I felt like my life had changed so much that night. I felt really good. The trip felt like it had stripped me naked away from the world and ravaged me, only to allow me to see the world as what it should be truly seen as. I would not recommend this substance to people, only because it is so new and there's not a whole lot known about the effects it has on the body. However, I do feel like it was completely worth it, and I have no regrets about taking the substance. Although the majority of the trip was terrifying, it was eye-opening.
December 16th, 2016. 150 micrograms, 1p LSD. I'm a 23-year-old student with significant experience with psychedelics, including a range of lysergamides, phenethylamines, and tryptamines. Just coming up on 6 years of regular tripping, close to 100 experiences under my belt. I am somewhat recently married. I'm 9 months in, and I'm midway through my master's project, facing the stress of PhD applications. The trip began fairly normally. The day before, I had cleaned the flat, taken an account of my current psychological situation so far, as I was conscious of it, and smudged a room with Palo Santo, myrrh, and frankincense in order to set the scene. There had been the ordinary pre-trip jitters and a little extra minor anxiety, knowing my wife wouldn't be about to muse upon and share thoughts with. I decided, however, to press on. My notes on paper read, "I deserve this, to relax after a long semester," and little did I know, there would be minimal relaxation to be had during this trip. Putting the 1.5 blotters under my front lip, I began my session at 10 a.m. I don't get any real alerts for the first 45 minutes, but for some reason, barely 30 minutes in and only 15 minutes after swallowing the blotters, my pupils were blown, and first effects were making themselves very much known. I began to feel a vague nausea, and my hands shook gently. I lay down and put on some music, trying to relax into the trip and flow with it, but something kept me a little on edge. Still, I consoled myself that this is how the come-up is, and put my head back to listen to the music. By an hour in, the music was causing a kind of intensified autonomous sensory meridian response, with tingles and chills running across my scalp and cascading across my body. It was not until 90 minutes in that the headspace really began to develop. However, with a myriad of questions spilling everywhere across my mind, seemingly innocuous questions like, does the house feel homely because it is our home, or is it our home because it now feels homely? All the way up to much larger questions like, how much of what we do as humans is just to elude the awareness of our mortality? The thought speed increased progressively across the half hour up to noon, until my short-term memory began to falter, and I found myself getting to some level of schizotypal thinking, where I could not fully identify myself with some of the thoughts I was having, and so externalized them into some mental presence. Whilst this projected entity was neither real nor malevolent, this was hard for me to process properly. I had some delusional notion of telepathic contact with some force outside my own mind, which, on reflection, was essentially little more than an internal current of thoughts that my ego couldn't attach itself to. By about 12:45, however, some degree of reintegration was reached, and I understood what had been happening. Still, the experience had been unsettling. I sat up and drank some water. My body still felt stiff and strained, and my jaw was tensed unnecessarily. I changed over the music, and was able, for 30 or so minutes, to drift off a little and reach some level of mental calm, though I could still feel the tension in my body. At about 13:15, T plus 3 hours and 15 minutes, my flatmate returned home. We sat in the front room for several hours, listening to the playlist that I had been listening to for the previous 30 minutes, generally conversing and messing about. There was, however, an ever-present sense of chaotic neutrality to her. I felt equal parts amused and set on edge, as though beneath this seemingly jovial interchange, there might lie the possibility of ill will towards me. This minor paranoia accompanied and went with the body tension, one increasing with the other, despite there being little sense of any casual link between them. After my flatmate returned to her room at about 16:15, the real psychoanalytical edge of the trip caught me sharp. I went down a kind of mental hole where I assessed my deepest fears. Ultimately, as some part of my mind pressed me for answers, I came to the conclusion that my deepest seated fear was that I didn't really care about anything, and that I was deluding myself into thinking that I genuinely cared about anything beyond its use to me, as a means to avoid facing mortality. It then washed over me, this existential numbness to the world, as if to show me what that is really like. In retrospect, I appreciate it was the contrast to me, the nature of that condition, with my real experience of living. But at the time, I felt like I'd cracked my facade open, and now my true nature was pouring forth. It was quite horrible. It wasn't until I heard a thought come through my head that I realized that this state of apathy was an illusion. I heard myself say, subvocally, "I wish my wife was here. I really need her right now." This snapped me back to reality, as I recalled all the sacrifices we make for one another, the sleepless nights spent worrying for one another, and the ecstatic joy I felt seeing her face on our wedding day. Like a heavy weight being lifted, I breathed a deep sigh of relief. By now, it was 1700, and I went back to my music. Though still tense and a little anxious, I was at that point just waiting for her to get home so I could hug her and tell her I loved her. At nearly 1800, she got home from a bad day at work, and I held her and tried to comfort her. It was melancholic but deeply rewarding to feel her and feel for her, sealing away that fear of all-pervading apathy. At 1900, feeling tense still, hot and uncomfortable, but with my wife happily chatting away to her mother, I went for a shower. The feeling of the cold water was like the washing away of all of the tension, a final catharsis at the end of what had been a whole day on edge, to a greater, or lesser, extent. I was down by 2000, psychologically at least, though I could not physically sleep until 1 o'clock the next morning. A brief note on the visual aspects. Throughout, CEV was present and intricate, but always vaguely upsetting or off-putting, with faces and nauseating fast geometric morphing patterns. OEV were fairly tame, with decent tracing and some breathing, and limited translucent geometric forms.
The most intense visual experience possible, an experience with 2CB by Kroptkinite. Posted to Erowid.org July 16th, 2001. I've recently discovered Erowid and found that the files for certain substances might benefit from descriptions of my experiences. For instance, there's a psychedelic that at Reed College, a very intellectual and psychedelic small liberal arts school in Portland, Oregon, where a student reportedly invented and first synthesized bromo in the 1960s, is called bromo or bromomescaline. I've read elsewhere that it's the same as 2CB, which I will assume it probably is. The 2CB files don't do bromo justice though, because the experience reports describe oral dosing, but bromo's true power can only be harnessed by snorting. So, over a decade ago, I was a student at Reed. My friends and I obtained some bromo from MB, a dearly departed wonderful man whom Reedies from the late 80s will recall with love and mourning. MB knew that we were all experienced acid veterans, and he knew of my propensity for taking big doses of things, so he gave us hits bigger than the recommended 25 milligrams. We'd heard about the intense pain caused by snorting bromo. Getting kicked in the face by a psychedelic mule was a common description, so we were a little wary. I was the promoter of the experiment, so I went first. I snorted the hit and told my friends it's not all that bad, and proceeded to walk to the other end of the student union to pick up a guitar. Then it started. Searing pain, as hydrobromic acid ate away my nasal passages and sinuses. Agony. S&R, having heard me say it wasn't so bad, were now snorting their doses. This is hellish, I told them, and their eager-to-trip smiles changed into expressions of fright. D, not joining the trip, watched all this with amusement. Meanwhile, I was ramping up, my body speeding and rushing as if I'd just freebased to grab a blow and topped it off with a fat line of meth. I distractedly plucked at the guitar, and the tones sounded as if they came from far, far away. Intense rushes coursing through my body. I put the guitar down and stepped onto the SU porch. On the distant horizon, I could see storm clouds of swirling colours and shapes. The hallucinatory cloud bank was approaching with hurricane speed and increasing in velocity, coming from every direction toward me, such that I was at the centre of a rapidly shrinking circle of relatively lucid sensory perception. Along with intense body rushes, I was getting nauseous and my stomach was spasming. The storm of visuals closed in on me from 360 degrees, and at the very moment that it enveloped me, my stomach muscles clenched hard and I projectile vomited, sending my dinner 6 feet across the porch onto the grass below a nearby tree. Now immersed in the most intense visuals that I've ever experienced on any psychedelic, and I've done almost all of them, I saw my spout of vomit as a luminescent stream of gorgeous rich colours and rapidly spinning, rapidly ever-changing geometric shapes. I was humbled and awed by my vomit's beauty. The pain from the snort now seemed like a distant memory of an insignificant triviality, its intensity dwarfed by the intensity of the swirling tornado of intricate visuals that I was now experiencing. I can't even begin to describe it, so I won't cheapen the visual experience by attempting to describe what cannot be put into words. I returned to the student union, and although I was literally almost blinded by visuals, I could make out the image of S&R holding their noses in pain. This is unbelievably beautiful, I told them. No amount of acid could ever produce visions like these. Remarkably, there was very little head trip, so I could loosely and rationally and calmly contemplate what was happening to my sensorium. Despite the relatively slight head trip of the sort that psychedelics normally produce, there was a deeply spiritual aspect to the trip. I could strongly sense the presence of Mescalito, or whatever entity had overseen my peyote and mescaline trips in the past, and who was never present for acid or mushroom trips. 6 or 7 hours later, S and I had returned to our group house and went for a walk in the neighbourhood, smoking a fat one of the kind Northern Lights indica. The intensity had passed, and we felt like we had almost come down. Now the visuals are down to about the equivalent of 6 or 8 100 mic hits of acid, I remarked. Or maybe 10, S replied. Although I've taken hundreds of psychedelic trips, I never did bromo again. The one extremely intense experience was far enough for me. But my life was never quite the same after that night. I recommend snorting bromo only to experienced and intrepid psychonauts. Others should consume it orally, which causes effects more comparable to mescaline or acid, or maybe not at all.
Well, this is an update to my experience of the drug ephenidine, which pretty much killed me from my point of view. In my last trip report, I said I took 2 grams of the substance by mistake. I didn't intend to do that dose because it was too high. Luckily for me, I'd built up tolerance in that experience, especially as I was home alone. This time, I was kind of down as my partner told me she was going to commit suicide one day, so I left her in bed, ran downstairs, and stupidly, without measuring the substance, took a large amount, around 1 to 2 grams using a tablespoon. I really wasn't thinking straight. I wasn't intending to commit suicide or anything, I just wanted to chill and have fun. Usually I would dissolve 1 gram in 100 milligrams of water and use a syringe to titrate a safe dose. This time I didn't. Very stupid and dangerous. Next, I put on some music and started to meditate. It must have been 15 minutes later, I don't know, but the next thing I remember is banging into a door upstairs with excitement. I wanted to share a cool secret of some sort, something to do with the Matrix. I don't even remember walking, just falling. I was thinking, what the fuck? I don't know what's happening here. My girlfriend rushes out and asks what's wrong. At this moment, I became lucid and unaware that I was foaming at the mouth. I was still talking about the block of power in the Matrix. She wanted to phone an ambulance. I didn't want that, so I somehow ran down the stairs, hid my stash, then ran back up them, and the next thing I knew, I awoke in the hospital in the ICU with tubes inserted into my penis and other tubes connected to my arms and machines. I was placed into a chemically induced coma for 3 to 4 days as none of the benzos would calm me down. It took 2 police officers, 2 security, and other members of staff to restrain me. It was hard enough dragging my ass to the hospital as I had been delirious. It's bizarre how I remembered none of this. I was in a very serious condition. It was as if I had a PCP overdose. I remember nothing at all. My behavior was okay until I saw people who looked like police and I guess subconsciously became defensive. The hospital took my girlfriend into a private room and told her I was probably going to die. This must have been horrible for her as she didn't know if she should tell my parents. She did let my brother know. To me, that day I died. As the lights went out, I remember thinking, I hope my family is okay. Then everything went pitch black. I then woke up. I wasn't surprised. It was as if I had expected it somehow, remembering on a subconscious level. 4 days in the hospital and tubes up your dick is not fun. When I returned home, I flushed all 25 grams of the material to never touch it again. I love drugs, but I'm not going to risk my life like that again. It's an interesting substance, but it's also very dangerous and it can lead to redosing or mistakes. I would dose low and make sure the stuff is out of reach and avoid mixing with other substances just to be safe.